Are you aware that in 1960, four teenagers will go out camping and they will be found brutally murdered the next morning by a local jogger? These murders were so notorious that it had inspired the original Friday the 13th movie. This is the true crime story of the Lake Bodom murders. In the state of Finland, four teenagers will go out on a camping trip. These teenagers were named Anya, Mila, Sappho, and Niles. Both of the girls were 15 years old and the two boys were 18 years old. The teenagers had went out on an innocent camping trip, basically exploring the woods, nature, basically having a good time. All four teens would have been spending so much time in the lake called Lake Bodom, where they basically just hang out there. They went for hiking, walking around the woods, exploring nature. Basically, no causing physical harm or damage or disrespect to this property. Now, this was all an innocent camping trip and they just wanted to hang out there. But unfortunately, once they set up their tents and fell asleep, their innocent camping trip was no longer an innocent camping trip. As the teens are sleeping peacefully inside their tent, all cozy and very comfortably, the unexpected happened and it was so random and so fast and quick that the four teens couldn't even put up a fight and they had nothing. There was nothing that they could have done to avoid this situation. As the teens were sleeping, unbeknownst to them, somebody else has been watching them the entire time throughout the day or when they were hiking or setting up their camping tent. And they had no idea that somebody else was also on their tail, and they had no idea that a fifth member was invited to their group. This was an unknown figure who had watched the teens set up their tent and basically waited for them to go to sleep. The unknown figure, or the unknown stalker, who was basically surrounding their tent, purposely cut down the tent spikes that basically would support your tent and keep it up, and they pulled out a sharp hunting knife and they began stabbing viciously through the tent fabric into the young bodies. And eventually, four of the teens woke up. They're reacting to getting brutally stabbed, and whoever is doing this is keeping the tent pinned down and proceeds stabbing them multiple times. Now, unfortunately, three of the teens did die from multiple stab wounds, but fortunately, one of them did survive. This person was named Niles. So he was the only one that survived, and the four teens were discovered by a local hiker who was hiking in the middle of the forest, who was also there at Lake Bottom, maybe jogging by or walking by, and they discovered the tent fully torn down with blood stains on the outside of the perimeter of the tent. And that's when they discovered the bodies of the young teenagers. So after the jogger discovers their lifeless bodies outside the tent and it's completely coated in blood, the jogger immediately contacted the police. After the killer was done completely mutilating the four teenagers, the killer had completely taken and stolen their personal items, such as clothing, their wallets, and the killer also stolen some of their shoes. However, these stolen items were later recovered a mile away from the nearby campground where the teenagers were brutally attacked, and the police managed to recover the missing clothes and also their missing wallets. For a few years, the police would later do an investigation to see who might have been interested in brutally attacking these four teens with no reason and no motive. They would look into three suspects a few years later. The police narrowed it down to three suspects. The first suspect is a man who lived nearby the camp who didn't like campers nor joggers. This guy was the main suspect because would find quite an enjoyment for throwing little pebbles such as rocks at little children, and he pretty much laughed about it, shrugged it off like it's no big deal. It's just a thing that he usually does. And since he didn't like people at the camp living around him, like camping or just hiking randomly, he would always seem to cause a lot of drama by throwing pebbles at anybody who walks nearby. However, in one particular night when he became extremely drunk, he had confessed to killing the four teenagers who were found brutally murdered. And it was most likely he told this to the police. However, his wife had told the police that he had been with her the entire night when the murders took place. Now, here's the most suspicious thing about this. 9 years later, he had took his own life by drowning himself, and I believe this was done is because either the stress that the fact that people are accusing him for committing this terrible crime, or he actually did it. So, in a way to free himself and to avoid getting locked away in prison, he took his own life by drowning himself. And after his death, the wife would finally tell his actual alibi, saying, "No, this guy wasn't with me during the murders. He was out somewhere else. He wasn't with me." So she basically is telling the truth. But now that she's gone, she was confident and more brave enough to basically tell what actually happened. Because this guy who basically got mad at anybody who was camping near his property to the point where he would throw rocks at, he would usually threaten her from time to time, and she was extremely afraid of him. The second suspect was named Hans. This man was a former KGB member and he was suspected to be a former Nazi. Now, here's what makes this guy very interesting to the connection of these murders. This guy would go to a local hospital covered in bloodstains all over his clothes, and he had dirt underneath his fingernails. And also, the hospital staff would state that this guy acted extremely weird, nervous, or extremely scared that he would soon one day worry about the serious consequences for something. So, this guy was a little off. Bloodstained clothes, dirty fingernails, and a very fidgety appearance. It's also interesting that this guy would give police a solid alibi to the point that he was no longer investigated or ruled as a suspect by police. However, in his deathbed, he would later confess to the murders of these four teenagers. Well, the three, one of them survived. Now, the third and final suspect of the three suspects that I talked so far, you're not going to believe this. The only one survivor during the time where the four teenagers were murdered and one of them survived, well, only one survivor was ruled as a suspect, Niles. Here's one thing I didn't tell you guys. His shoes were found with the items taken from the victims. But this wasn't enough evidence for the police to arrest him and take him to jail. But 44 years later, when the case was reopened in 2004 with technology improvements, they managed to get traces of blood from his shoes that were discovered, and the blood that was smeared on his shoes matched the blood from the victims that were found brutally slain. Now it was believed that Niles was jealous of Sepho because Sepho was dating one of the girls that was his girlfriend, that he had completely brutally killed these three teens and made it look like that somebody attacked him, that he was the innocent victim himself, to not only make himself look innocent and get away with murder, but he also killed these three teenagers out of rage and jealousy. And with these three evidence against him, he was eventually arrested. But a year later, surprisingly enough, he won an appeal and he was released to the public. So most likely, this case will never be solved. It will remain unsolved, as a matter of fact. This type of true crime story will always be known as the unsolved murders of Lake Bodom. And that was True Crime Episode 3 of the Lake Bodom Murders that inspired the original 1980 Friday the 13th movie. Do you guys completely find it devastating and frustrating that we will never know who the true killer is? Do you think that Niles has something to do with it? Do you think that he worked with the other two guys and they possibly could have come up with an evil sick plan, kill the three teenagers, and basically attack him to make it look like that they attacked him, left him for dead, but they didn't realize that he could have still been alive? That's actually a good theory. I think that all three of them had something to do with it, despite the fact that he was younger at the time. Him being 18 makes him an adult, so I guess that's not too far off there. Let me know what your theories are. What do you guys think? Are you on the same page as me? Do you see where I'm getting at? Or do you think that it's completely something different? Somebody else might have had something to do with this aside from the suspect, Niles, or the other two men that have previously died? Let me know in the comments below. Now remember, guys, I'm going to be doing more true crime videos like this. This is episode 3 of True Crime Asylum.